The air solidified around the dining room table, trapping the three of us in a silence far louder than any argument we had ever had. My coffee cup, still warm, rattled lightly in the saucer as my hands clenched beneath the polished oak. I had just casually mentioned needing access to the home equity line to finally replace the leaky roof, a roof I had personally patched for the last 3 winters, when my son, 28-year-old Daniel, looked me dead in the eye, his expression void of affection, and delivered the sentence, "Dad, this house is not yours anymore." The words didn't register as a metaphor or even as sarcasm. They were stated as a plain, factual amendment to the reality I thought I inhabited. It was the absolute clinical precision of the delivery that shattered the moment. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He simply lowered the boom. His mother, Maria, sat across from him, her gaze fixed intently on the floral pattern of the tablecloth, her silence a heavy, suffocating accomplice. In that instant, I knew the insult wasn't just Daniel's. It was a manifesto signed by the both of them. A raw, primal panic tightened my chest, but beneath that fear, a colder, more dangerous clarity began to form. This wasn't an impulsive slight over money. This was the first blunt cut of a prepared surgical procedure. I didn't yet understand the full architecture of the betrayal that had been built beneath my feet, or the staggering price tag attached to Daniel's casual declaration of war. All I knew was that I was standing on the precipice, gazing down into an abyss of organized cruelty, and that the single line, "This house is not yours," was merely the preamble to a volume of destruction I hadn't even begun to read. The immediate violation was staggering, yet I felt an icy premonition that the very foundation of my life, my identity as a provider, a husband, a father, was about to be systematically dismantled, brick by agonizing brick. My name is Arthur, and for 30 years I was the immovable pillar upon which this household rested. I was the reliable engine, the one who handled the early mornings, the late nights, the triple shifts during the recession, all to ensure that the mortgage on this 2-story, 3-bedroom sanctuary, my sanctuary, was paid off before I hit 60. The house wasn't just wood and drywall, it was 22 years of sweat equity, of Saturday mornings spent tiling the bathroom floor, of scraped knuckles fixing the furnace in the dead of winter, of the overwhelming quiet pride of knowing that I had secured a life free of debt for my family. I'd always defined myself by my utility and my dedication. I wasn't the charismatic husband or the emotionally present father. I was the provider. I was the rock. My life was simple. Work hard, pay the bills, provide the comfort. Maria and I had carved out a comfortable, predictable existence in this quiet suburb, raising Daniel to adulthood, watching him graduate college, and then encouraging him to move back home temporarily while he found his footing. This was the house where we celebrated birthdays, hosted endless Thanksgiving dinners, and where I envisioned Maria and me growing old, sitting on the porch swing I had built myself. Just last week, I was helping Daniel jumpstart his aging sedan, joking about how he needed to stop treating my garage like a free car wash. Yesterday, I was transferring funds to cover Maria's unexpected medical deductible. My world was solid, predictable, built on the mutual, unspoken contract of family loyalty and earned ownership. I was Arthur, the successful, stable patriarch, and this house was the incontrovertible proof of my success. That stability, that entire definition of self, had just been reduced to ashes by 6 calculated words from the mouth of the child I had sacrificed everything to protect. I looked at Daniel, then at Maria, still staring at the tablecloth, and the horrifying truth settled in. The life I thought was normal, the life I had worked 3 decades to maintain, was gone, and the betrayal was just beginning to breathe. The breathing stopped. My lungs seemed to realize they were only pulling in stale air contaminated by 30 years of shared lies. Maria did not move, gripping the edge of the polished mahogany as if anchoring herself against a sudden typhoon. Daniel, oblivious to the seismic shift he had triggered, simply asked if he could be excused to start his homework. I gave him a nod, a movement of the neck that felt like grinding granite, and watched him leave, his casual stride taking the future of the house with him. The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized, vibrating with unspoken accusations. I did not raise my voice, nor did I demand an explanation. I didn't need one. The explanation was the cold, immutable fact sitting between us, freezing the blood in my veins. Instead, I stood up, slowly, deliberately, and walked past her without a word, heading toward my study. The house, usually a sanctuary of controlled order, felt hostile, every corner whispering of misdirection. I spent the next 3 days in that study, pretending to manage the global complexities of the firm. But in reality, I was monitoring the rhythm of my own home, a newly vigilant warden in his own prison. Maria adapted instantly to the war footing. She didn't press. She didn't apologize. She simply ceased to exist in my gravitational field. Meals were staggered, not shared. Our conversations, once meandering and intimate, were reduced to logistical communiques about Daniel's schedule or the thermostat settings. This deliberate coldness, this professional detachment from the woman who had slept beside me for half my adult life, was the first profound insult. She wasn't fighting for forgiveness, she was simply managing the separation, treating me like a difficult client whose contract was already terminated. Her lack of emotional collapse suggested that this betrayal was not a sudden lapse, but a long-term, meticulously maintained architectural marvel of deceit. The shift became palpable when I tried to review the quarterly school trust accounts. Usually the statements for Daniel's private boarding school, the Hawthorne Academy, were routed. Through my office, standard practice for oversight and tax purposes. When I called my secretary to pull the latest batch, she paused, her voice tight with professional embarrassment, and informed me that the mailing address had been quietly updated 6 months prior. Not to Maria's office or a general family P.O. box, but to a discreet, unmarked private service in an entirely different district of the city, a service that required a specific, non-family key code to access. This was the first physical piece of exclusion. It wasn't just a biological secret, it was a financial and administrative division that had been carefully established under my nose. Why change the mailing address now, after 15 years of stability, unless the approaching crisis demanded tighter control? I realized, with a sickening lurch, that Daniel's casual comment had not been the beginning of the end, but merely the public announcement of an elaborate, ongoing operation. She hadn't been preparing for the truth to come out. She had been preparing for my inevitable investigation. The truth was far more corrosive than I had imagined. Maria was not a panicked sinner. She was a strategic opponent, quietly dismantling my access to the very structures I believed I controlled, piece by calculated piece. The stability was not just gone, it had been weaponized against me. I needed to see what else she had silently rerouted. The first place I looked was the digital ledger, not the main accounts, which I knew would be fiercely protected or already emptied, but the quarterly report archive for the property holdings in the Cayman trusts. It was a redundant system, mostly for internal compliance audits, something I hadn't touched in months because the maintenance of its security infrastructure was beneath my usual scope. Maria always managed the lower-tier credentials for accessibility purposes, citing my frequent travel. I typed in the old shared administrative password, expecting the familiar green verification splash, a minor victory of predictable access. Instead, the screen flashed a sterile white notification. User profile deactivated. Contact system administrator. The shock was purely intellectual at first, a computational error I could fix with a quick call to the IT firm. But the IT firm was mine, and the system administrator technically was Maria. The realization crystallized. This wasn't a standard password expiry, it was a surgical removal. She hadn't just changed the key, she had professionally decommissioned the entire lock in my hand. It was a prophylactic move, taken preemptively, not because she thought I would look today, but because she knew the type of man I was, the type who eventually double-checks the paperwork. If she had taken the time to lock me out of the archive, the historical record, the mere shadow of the money, then the actual liquid assets were long gone, moved through channels she had spent months perfecting. The depth of her patience was terrifying. She had been operating on a separate timeline, building walls around me while I slept beside her. I pulled back from the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes, turning the library into an interrogation room. I couldn't confront her yet. I needed more than a digital lockout. I needed the physical evidence, the undeniable proof that confirmed the sheer scale of the theft, not just of money, but of my future. I crept out of the study, the polished wood floors amplifying the dread in my steps. The house was too quiet. Weaponized normalcy was her finest achievement. She was in the kitchen, preparing one of her meticulously balanced continental breakfasts, the smell of fresh coffee and toasted brioche filling the air, a tableau of domestic fidelity that should have been comforting, but now felt like a set design for a very brutal play. Her back was to me. Her posture was perfect, straight, calm, the opposite of a woman panicking about impending discovery. I noted the way she moved, precise, unhurried, as if she were fulfilling a destiny she had long ago ordained. I watched her for a full minute, unable to speak, the phrase "user profile deactivated" echoing in the silence between us. My access to the archives was gone, but there was one thing she couldn't simply wipe from a server: the hard copy agreements, the physical contracts that detailed the transfer of the holding company shares. I walked past her with a neutral, non-committal grunt that sounded like, "Good morning," heading towards the second floor. The safe room was hidden behind a bookshelf in the master bedroom, accessible only by a voice-activated biometric lock tied to my specific vocal frequency. Theoretically, I pressed my palm against the scanner and spoke the code sequence, Aegis 794. The small green light blinked twice, hesitating, before turning a solid, accusatory red. The mechanical click that usually signaled the release of the deadbolt never came. I tried again, slower, projecting the command clearly: red light, failure. My heart didn't race, it plummeted, cold and heavy, realizing the true nature of her rerouting. She hadn't just changed the password on a low-tier account. She had managed to override the primary security protocols of the one physical space I believed was untouchable. To do that, she needed access to the external security consultants, the high-level encryption codes, and perhaps most damningly, she needed to have convinced them somehow that I was the liability. This was not the work of a few panicked weeks. This was an operation requiring months of cultivated relationships and deep-seated technical espionage. I hammered my fist against the mahogany shelf, a dull, dead sound. The lock wasn't broken, it was listening, but it was obeying a new master. I heard Maria's soft footsteps ascending the stairs. She stopped just outside the bedroom door, not entering, not needing to. Her voice was smooth, devoid of heat, carrying only the faintest trace of professional concern. "Is everything all right, darling? You seem distressed. Did you have trouble with the coffee machine again?" That question, the casual insertion of a mundane, manageable problem, the coffee machine, directly opposite the insurmountable, catastrophic problem, the locked safe, was the most calculated cruelty yet. It was the moment I stopped seeing her as a wife who had cheated and started seeing her as the architect of my financial and emotional ruin. Her question wasn't concern, it was a confirmation that she knew exactly what I was trying to do, and that she had already sealed the vault. The initial fracture had widened into a chasm, separating me not just from my assets, but from the reality I had inhabited only yesterday. I knew, standing there staring at the immovable barrier, that the next step was no longer about retrieving something, but about surviving the inevitable collapse. The air in the house had thickened into a cold, suffocating medium. We moved around each other now not as husband and wife, but as two high-stakes litigants sharing temporary custody of a crumbling edifice. Dinners were silent theaters of resentment, where the clinking of silverware sounded like distant tiny alarms. She maintained a chilling composure, her movements precise, her gaze flat and devoid of the warmth that had sustained me for a decade. The initial rage had curdled into a cold, strategic paranoia, forcing me into a performance of normalcy that strained every nerve. I knew I was being watched, analyzed, waiting for the crack in my facade that would confirm her victory. My focus shifted entirely from confrontation to cold reconstruction. piecing together the timeline of betrayal that extended far deeper than the recent bank statements suggested. I needed leverage, a definitive proof of premeditation that went beyond her locking the accounts. I avoided speaking of money altogether, treating her with a distant, formal courtesy that seemed to disconcert her slightly. She preferred me broken and emotional. This temporary detente allowed me brief windows of opportunity. One Tuesday, while she was purportedly at a charity luncheon, the kind of meaningless high society pretense she excelled at, I revisited the study. I had always suspected she had a secondary personal safe, separate from the primary household vault we managed jointly. Hidden behind a false panel in the old mahogany bookshelves, I found it, a small biometric lockbox. It was a risky gamble, but I remembered setting up her fingerprint access years ago, and my own print, surprisingly, still opened the panel protecting the box itself. Inside, beneath a stack of innocuous deeds and insurance policies, lay a heavily embossed envelope. It bore the logo of Sterling & Thorne, my former corporate law firm, the place I had left under amicable circumstances 3 years prior to Focus on Family. I tore the heavy linen paper open, my hands shaking not from fear, but from a growing certainty that this was not about money alone. It wasn't a banking statement, nor a divorce settlement draft. It was a formal letter, dated 6 months prior, addressed directly to me. It detailed a concrete offer to rejoin Sterling & Thorne in a senior consulting role, a high-profile, high-salary position that would have immediately restored my professional relevance and, critically, my independent, financial standing. It was the perfect escape route, the lifeline I hadn't known I needed until I read the final paragraph, which hit me with the force of a physical blow. We regret to inform you, however, that due to the sensitive nature of the spousal conflict disclosed to us during our final background checks, we must formally withdraw this offer immediately, pending satisfactory resolution of the current domestic concerns. She hadn't just ruined me financially. She had poisoned my professional reputation preemptively, ensuring that any attempt I made to rebuild my life outside of her control was dead on arrival. The letter was proof that her malice wasn't reactive. It was strategic, extending back half a year, calculated to isolate me completely. She had killed my escape route before I even knew I was trapped, using the veiled threat of domestic instability to ensure I remained tethered and defenseless. The financial wall was merely the final physical manifestation of a far deeper, months-long campaign of systemic erasure. This realization was the true fracture. She had taken away my future, not just my present comfort. The strategic realization gave way to an icy paranoia that demanded immediate inventory. I didn't search for more evidence of her betrayal. I searched for my own anchor points. The small, fireproof safe, behind the loose panel in the laundry room, held the external drive containing 10 years of archived emails, contact lists, and critical digital contracts. My ghost life, the one she hadn't touched yet. It was gone, not moved, not hidden. The space was surgically empty, the dust pattern undisturbed, as if it had been lifted by a professional who knew exactly what they were taking and why. The disappearance of that drive meant the erasure of my verifiable history, the loss of every piece of correspondence that could prove her interference or my original intent. It was the digital equivalent of burning the Library of Alexandria, leaving me only with memory, which she was already successfully painting as unreliable. I said nothing. The realization that she had physically infiltrated my last sanctuary was a throat punch, but mentioning the missing drive would have been a tactical error, confirming that I was searching for escape and validating her paranoia. The silence that fell over the house was not peaceful. It was a pressurized vacuum. We moved past each other like two actors performing a tragicomedy in separate soundproof bubbles. Her polite inquiries about my day felt less like affection and more like surveillance reports, the questions precise and focused on my current stress levels, stress she had meticulously manufactured. Every shared meal was a grueling exercise in maintaining the facade of a man merely stressed by work, not one whose historical record had just been stolen from a hidden compartment. I watched her perfectly manicured hands buttering toast, knowing they had signed documents condemning my future. and the effort to keep my face neutral felt like holding a 100-pound weight above my head. The paranoia gnawed at the edges of sleep, manifesting as a physical need to confirm the extent of the damage. I checked the one remaining loose thread, the small, virtually forgotten savings account we'd opened for a hypothetical trip to Iceland. Money I'd explicitly funded with an old consulting bonus, earmarked mentally as absolute emergency escape fuel. I accessed the online portal using my phone, hiding the screen under the duvet, the glow illuminating the dread in my eyes. The balance was zero. That wasn't the ultimate shock. I expected the theft. The true punch came from the transaction detail. The entire 5-figure sum hadn't been transferred to her private investment portfolio or used for household expenses. It had been wired 3 days prior to a holding company I didn't recognize, labeled only with a vague legal code and a 3-day delay on the withdrawal notification, timed perfectly to prevent me from stopping the transfer once I noticed the first irregularities. The named entity, Veritas Holdings LLC, was a shell company designed for opaque asset transfers, often used to funnel substantial funds into specialized legal retainers without leaving a direct trail to an individual attorney. This wasn't merely opportunistic theft, this was preemptive war funding. She wasn't just isolating me to keep me compliant, she was building an arsenal for the inevitable confrontation, securing the best legal defense before I could even afford a consultation. The 6 months of calculated malice suddenly clicked into a terrifying final sequence. She hadn't just taken away my future comfort, she was actively paying to dismantle my past, fund my destruction, and guarantee that when the inevitable end came, I would be facing a legal machine powered by my own stolen resources. The quiet, cold professionalism of the transaction, the legal code, the holding company, the time delay, stripped away any remaining doubt that this was anything other than a planned, systematic annihilation. She was not reacting. She was conquering. The realization that I was sharing a bed with my executioner had an anesthetic quality. It numbed the initial rage and replaced it with an inhuman vigilance. I stopped sleeping. The house transformed overnight from a sanctuary into a highly sophisticated surveillance cage. Every breath she took, every muted notification from the phone she now carried everywhere, a sleek, unfamiliar model, became a potential flashpoint. She, meanwhile, adopted an unnerving mask of domestic perfection. Her movements were fluid, her tone serene, discussing benign things like grocery lists and garden maintenance, the very mundanity a calculated psychological weapon. The only tell was her eyes, which never quite met mine. They skimmed over my face as if checking off a chore, devoid of warmth, brimming instead with the quiet impatience of someone waiting for a clock to strike zero. My focus shifted from the legal documents, which were too abstract and cold, to the immediate, tangible threat she represented. I needed the human angle, the trigger that justified such scorched earth malice. The financial details confirmed how she was operating. I needed to know who else was pulling the strings. I began monitoring her movements, the precision of her alibis unsettling. She claimed extended hours at a newly joined book club. The club's social media showed she hadn't attended in months. The lies were lazy, yet delivered with a conviction that demanded silence, daring me to challenge her serene facade. One Tuesday, while she was purportedly at a charity lunch, a lie I confirmed with a swift check of her location settings on the main line, I went hunting. I bypassed the safe, the drawers, and the usual spots. I went straight for the rarely used storage area in the basement, where she kept old files and seasonal decorations. It was there, taped securely inside a forgotten Christmas ornament box, that I found it, a small encrypted USB drive. My hands were steady, past the point of shaking. This wasn't panic, but surgical determination. Connecting the drive to my hidden laptop was an act of pure, trembling desperation. The password wasn't a birthday or an anniversary. It was a date I didn't recognize, but after 3 attempts, I tried the date of our first major argument, the one she always cited to others as the beginning of the end. It opened instantly. The files weren't financial or legal. They were architectural blueprints, detailed renderings, not for our house, but for a vast waterfront property 200 miles south, purchased 6 months ago under a limited liability trust I had never encountered. This wasn't a rental or an investment. This was a future home. More chilling than the floor plans were the accompanying modification notes. They detailed extensive changes to the master suite, specifically his and hers offices, and an expansion of the boathouse. Next to the space, designated his, there was a handwritten note scrawled in her recognizable cursive, "Needs better light for drafting." The word drafting hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. My blood ran cold, recognizing the profession of the man she had always called her confidant and business associate, a man whose sudden brief appearances over the last year had always been excused by urgent client mergers. The professional code was clearly a lie. He was an architect. It was the precision of the planning that truly broke the shell of my remaining denial. This was not a quick fling financed by temporary rage. This was an entire parallel life constructed brick by stolen brick. She hadn't just been planning my financial ruin, she'd been meticulously planning their future, leveraging my assets to build a sanctuary for her and the man who, I now understood, had been helping her design the very legal documents destined to dismantle me. The ultimate insult was not the theft of the money, but the fact that I had unknowingly financed the architect of my own destruction to have a sunnier office in their shared paradise. I wasn't just being discarded. I was the essential involuntary investor in their happily ever after. I had to find out his name, his actual role in the legal setup, and if he knew the precise moment I would discover, the blueprints. The silence between us was over. Now it was time for quiet warfare. The quiet warfare began not with shouting, but with meticulous, late-night data mining. I bypassed the superficial clutter of his home office, ignoring the neatly organized files related to our joint accounts, and focused instead on the dusty external hard drive tucked behind the printer, the one he always insisted was just for old photos. The encryption was basic, a concession to complacency perhaps, or maybe a belief that I would never stoop to true espionage. Deep within the drive, under a folder labeled Legacy Planning, I found the digital blueprint, not just of a house, but of their entire future. It wasn't merely a preliminary purchase agreement, it was an incorporated business structure, a holding company registered offshore. The architect, whose identity I now held cold in my hand, was listed not as a designer, but as the co-director and primary shareholder. My partner had funneled large amounts of our liquidity, the seed capital for our retirement, directly into this shell corporation, effectively transforming the affair from a clandestine weekend hobby into a fully operational independent financial entity designed to exclude me entirely. The discovery choked the air out of the room. This wasn't romance. This was premeditated. Corporate theft wrapped in the guise of infidelity. I printed nothing, copied everything to an encrypted stick, and returned the hard drive precisely as I had found it. The next morning, the silence in the kitchen was glacial. He commented on the weather. I acknowledged it with a neutral tilt of my head. Every movement was slow, deliberate, the way two predators circle each other after the scent of blood has been detected, but before the final pounce. He knew I knew something. The rigidity of my shoulders, the way my eyes no longer met his but drifted over him, assessing structural weaknesses. But he didn't know the extent of the evidence I possessed. The escalation came when I subtly introduced a term I'd seen in the offshore documents, non-recourse funding. I tossed it out during dinner, ostensibly discussing a vague market trend. His jaw locked. The fork he was holding clattered onto his plate, a sound shattering the brittle peace we had maintained. "Where did you hear that term?" he demanded, the smoothness gone, replaced by a raw, guttural paranoia. I pretended indifference, shrugging off the question as if it were a minor professional curiosity. His subsequent denial was a performance worthy of an Emmy. He launched into a tirade about my paranoia, my constant need to manufacture drama, insisting that I was trying to sabotage his legitimate, innocent business venture, the one that apparently involved a massive property in a foreign country and an international partnership with a man he had never mentioned. He didn't just deny the architect's existence, he over-explained the complexity of his life insurance policies and claimed that his recent trips were about securing a new, exclusive contract that required strict confidentiality. The sheer volume of lies, the frantic detail in his defense, confirmed every horrible suspicion. He wasn't just guilty of the affair and the theft, he was actively denying reality while standing in the physical space we shared, breathing the same air. But the real nauseating drop came later that week. I had begun tracing the paper trail backwards, tracking the shell company's expenditures. I found invoices for international relocation services, not just furniture shipping, but expedited visa applications, private school registrations, and high-end storage for items designated as irreplaceable archives. They weren't just planning a vacation home, they were liquidating their lives here to start an entirely new one there, scheduled for the beginning of the next fiscal quarter, barely 8 weeks away. I saw the dates. I saw the names listed on the school applications. My partner's name, the architect's name, and a third, unfamiliar name. A child's name. A child. The world tilted sideways. This wasn't just a betrayal between two adults. This was a ready-made family, waiting for the clock to run down on my unwitting sponsorship. I realized, with a sickening clarity that felt like a surgical incision, that I hadn't been financing an affair or a house. I had been providing the foundation, the financial stability, for the entire infrastructure of their future. Life complete with the offspring I had always wanted, but he had always deferred. The lie was not a mistake. It was the entire framework of his existence for the last 18 months, culminating in a planned, clean escape. The time for silent observation was over. I needed concrete proof of their digital communication, the evidence that tied the financial fraud directly to the emotional deceit, before the 8-week countdown hit zero. The silence of the house at 3:17 a.m. was not peaceful. It was a pressurized vacuum, amplifying the click of the keys and the furious beating in my temples. His secondary work laptop, usually secured in a travel safe only he accessed, sat heavy and cold on the mahogany desk. I had bypassed the physical lock with a flimsy hairpin and a sheer adrenaline rush that made my hands steady despite the ethical chasm I was diving into. The password screen mocked me, a digital barrier protecting not just privacy, but an entire alternate reality. I cycled through every significant date we shared, our anniversary, the date of our engagement, his mother's birthday. Each attempt met with a harsh, red, access denied. Despair tightened its grip, threatening to pull me back into the safe, ignorant warmth of my own bedroom. Then, a flicker of wicked insight. He hadn't just planned to leave me, he planned to erase. So I typed the date of the incorporation of the shell company I'd found buried deep in his tax files 3 weeks ago, followed by the year he had projected we would move into our forever home, a future that never materialized. The screen flashed green. Welcome, Richard. The breath left my body, a silent, painful whoosh. This wasn't a mistake. This was a calculated insult, using the instruments of his grand fraud as the keys to his infidelity. The desktop was pristine, a superficial mask of professionalism. I bypassed his general email, knowing the real communication would be encrypted or archived. I navigated straight to the deep system files, employing the basic forensic software I'd spent the last week mastering via desperate late-night tutorials. The search query was simple, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. Liquidation schedule. The system hesitated, then yielded a single heavy file labeled Project Chimera Final. The contents were not financial projections, they were blueprints for destruction. Dated just 4 days prior, the document detailed the accelerated sale of every shared liquid asset, the investment portfolio, the equity line on the beach condo, the private sale of his vintage car collection. The timeline had been drastically reduced. The 8-week countdown I had been mentally preparing for was obsolete. The final transfer was scheduled for exactly 37 days from today. He wasn't waiting for the legal term limits. He was executing a smash and grab. The beneficiary of the massive wire transfer was not a holding account, but a Swiss entity named Viridian Capital Partners, a name I immediately recognized from the leaked Panama Papers as a known conduit for illicit funds and jurisdictional evasion. My hands started to shake, not from fear, but from the realization that I was facing a level of malice that bordered on psychopathy. I cross-referenced Viridian Capital Partners with his recent correspondence. The files revealed a series of encrypted chats masked as corporate advisories, but the content shifted abruptly. "Did you secure the Belize residency permits? V says it's critical for the final move." And then, the personal punch. "I can't wait for you to meet them. The kids are going to love the island." The kids. He didn't mean our theoretical future children, he meant her children. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving a cold, hard mask. This wasn't a woman he was having an affair with. This was a partner in crime, a co-architect of my financial and emotional ruin, and she was already a mother, a complete ready-made family being funded by the systematic theft of my life's work. A subsequent search, focused now on the personal angle, led me to a folder simply titled Future. Inside was the final devastating piece of evidence, a scanned, notarized document from a small, remote island notary detailing the purchase agreement for a private villa, complete with aerial photographs of a blindingly white beach. Attached to the purchase agreement was a pre-nuptial agreement draft, explicitly stating the terms of their upcoming marriage and the division of assets after the incorporation of Viridian Capital. The date of the proposed wedding, 35 days from now. 2 days before the planned financial obliteration. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. I was not being betrayed, I was being surgically extracted. He wasn't leaving me for another woman, he was using me to finance his new identity and his new family unit. The man sleeping peacefully upstairs was not just a liar, he was a thief executing a complex international felony. The time for observation was over. The need for proof had been horribly, abundantly fulfilled. The clock was no longer counting down to his escape. It was counting down to my retaliation. I couldn't confront him, not yet. The moment I did, he would trigger the transfer and disappear forever. I had to secure my position, remove the financial floor from under his feet, and use his own meticulously constructed digital footprint as the anchor for his destruction. My focus became lethally clear. The first step was to create a digital ghost. Using his access credentials and the knowledge gleaned from Project Chimera, I initiated a series of small, untraceable microtransfers to an offshore account I had quietly established years ago, a safety net he never knew existed. I copied and encrypted every file, the liquidation schedule, the Viridian correspondence, the prenup, the photographs. I left no trace of my intrusion, ensuring the timestamps appeared normal, blending seamlessly with his existing file structure. I looked at the sleeping pill bottle on the desk, the one he claimed he needed for stress. He wouldn't be needing them tomorrow, the game had changed. He thought he was 37 days from freedom. He was, in reality, 37 hours from waking up in the ruins of the empire he had built on my back. My countermove had begun. The silence of the house the next morning was surgical. I woke before the alarm, the unnatural clarity of my purpose overriding the need for sleep. I watched him stir, oblivious, chasing a non-existent dream of escape while I secured the final details of his reality check. My digital script, a series of timed, encrypted releases, was set to execute precisely at 9 a.m., coinciding with the opening bell and the start of the executive board meeting he would never attend. I had scheduled a simultaneous delivery to 4 key recipients: the lead partner at the firm handling the Viridian acquisition, our family solicitor, a highly placed anonymous tip line at the Financial Chronicle, and most crucially, his estranged sister, who had always suspected the predatory nature of his ambition. I dressed in the clothes I arrived in years. Hagama, a quiet symbolic shedding of the lavish costume his wealth had imposed. I left no note. My exit was not a request for an explanation or a declaration of war. It was the final, devastating period at the end of a very long sentence. As I stood by the kitchen island sipping lukewarm tea, I saw the exact moment the payload dropped. His work phone, lying innocently beside his discarded jacket, began to vibrate with a frantic, stuttered rhythm. Not a single call, but a barrage of texts, emails, and alerts that suggested institutional panic. The gentle hum quickly escalated into the sound of a dying machine, gasping for air. I heard his heavy footsteps descending the stairs, followed by the choked sound of confusion. He grabbed the phone, his face graying instantly as he scrolled through the initial headlines. Viridian deal implodes amidst confidentiality breach. Followed by an internal memo forwarded from his own board, detailing the existence of a highly restrictive prenuptial agreement he had conveniently failed to disclose to them, jeopardizing millions in stakeholder funds. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine across the vast, polished expanse of the kitchen. There was no anger, only the sudden, stark realization of total defeat. The man who had planned to vanish with calculated precision saw his entire foundation dissolve in real time, orchestrated by the ghost he thought he owned. "You," he whispered, the sound cracking like cheap plaster. He moved toward me, the threat implicit in his posture, but I simply raised my hand, not in defense, but in dismissal. "I finished your work for you," I stated, my voice steady, devoid of warmth or malice. "You wanted freedom and a clean slate. You've achieved the clean slate of your bank accounts, your reputation, and your marriage. You just didn't get to choose the timing or the costs." The power I felt was not the heat of vengeance, but the cold, satisfying weight of autonomy reclaimed. I turned and walked toward the front door, leaving him standing amidst the ruins of his digital empire, still clutching the phone that had delivered the death blow. Stepping out into the sharp morning air, the weight of the last decade lifted, replaced by a profound, agonizing emptiness. The immediate aftermath of justice is never triumphant fireworks. It's the quiet, echoing chamber of what was lost. I had spent 10 years believing in a co-pilot, only to discover I was navigating alone while he plotted an emergency ejection without a parachute for me. The truth I walked away with was not about money or deceit, but about the insidious nature of proximity. The people closest to you are not always your allies, and sometimes the deepest cuts are administered not by enemies in the dark, but by the supposed keepers of your light. I learned that loyalty is not guaranteed by shared history, nor is integrity inherent in a wedding vow. Trust, once shattered, reveals the jagged edges of self-preservation you never knew you possessed. I had to become the villain in his story to become the protagonist in my own, and that transformation cost me the last vestiges of my naivety. The price of freedom was the complete dismantling of a life built on a lie, and the effort it took confirmed the depth of the betrayal. Now, standing on the edge of the unknown, the only certainty is the ground beneath my own 2 feet. If you have ever felt the earth shift beneath you, if you have ever had to gather scattered evidence of your own worth and survival, then you understand the necessity of that absolute, painful silence that follows the final act of separation. It is the sound of reconstruction. It is the definitive proof that even when everything is taken, your capacity to rebuild remains the only asset that can never be seized.